the history department, the global studies and humanities program, the Muslim studies program, the peace and justice studies program. So there's a lot of support for sponsoring our wonderful speaker this evening. It's a real honor to have Ambassador Professor Daniel Abram, Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University. He was former ambassador to Egypt from the late 90s to 2001, and then to ambassador to Israel from 2000 to 2005. He spent 29 years in the Foreign Service in all kinds of interesting positions, and also was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Studies in the State Department, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. He has been instrumental in formulating and trying to influence policies towards the peace process in terms of Israelis and Palestinians. And if he'd only, I think, been listened to a little bit more over the years, perhaps it would have been resolved by now. But he's been engaged in lots of track 2 negotiations to get things started when things are stalled. He served, was appointed by Secretary of State John Kerry to serve on the Secretary's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. He was an advisor to the bipartisan Iraq study group. And he is co-author and editor, I think, of 3 fantastic books, all 3 of which I've used in different classes, where we emphasize the history of peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians and try to derive lessons from them. So one of them is Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, American Leadership in the Middle East, which kind of goes through and critiques all American administrations as to how they could have done things better, and at certain moments, whether if they had, there could have been a kind of decisive difference in previous efforts to negotiate peace. He's co-author of The Peace Puzzle, Americans' Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, which gives a really deep historical kind of analysis of efforts at Israeli, Syrian, and Israeli and Palestinian peace, and editors of Pathways to Peace, America and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, which I also think is a phenomenal book that includes Israeli and Palestinian and Jordanian and American voices and reflections as to past efforts at negotiations and what can be learned with them. And through all these books, there is a passion and a drive for urgency to reach a conflict and really solid, reflective policy recommendations for doing so. So he is kind of the model of policy-relevant research for academics and has a real insider's view in that, and also acts as a public intellectual. So at least once a month you can read one of his articles in so many different outlets where he's providing continual policy recommendations in order to move things forward. So it's a real great honor for us to listen to you today. Thanks for coming, and I hope it will be thought-provoking and will spur some good discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be back at Michigan State University. I was here some years ago and enjoyed it enough that when Professor Aronoff extended the invitation to come back, I jumped at the opportunity. I also want to recognize Mike Aronoff, Professor Myron Aronoff, who's a friend long-standing and part of the, not just the immediate Aronoff family, but the larger family of those who have really dedicated their lives to trying to understand this very challenging region of the world, the Middle East. I've been beset by a memory basically since 2011, the beginning of the Arab Spring, the memory of a cartoon that I saw as a child. And I look around the room, and probably many of you in this room also saw it. It was a cartoon involving the construction of a skyscraper set to the music of the Hungarian Rhapsody. And the construction engineer, who was also the conductor of the music, would conduct the music as the bricklayers were laying the bricks. And this skyscraper was being built way up into the sky. And as the music of the Rhapsody comes to an end, he shuts the front door of the building, and the building collapses. And the reason I've been beset by this memory since 2011 is thinking back over the nearly 30 years that I spent trying to understand the Middle East, trying to construct an idea of what this region was all about, and then to have this moment of hope, which is essentially when the skyscraper gets constructed. The people come out to Tahrir Square, people declare themselves in favor of democratic revolutions, and only to see that collapse as this symphony of political developments in the Middle East comes to an end. I'll stop the analogy at that point, but it's a way of introducing what I want to talk about tonight, which will end with a focus on the Arab-Israeli conflict. But I don't think you can get there, especially today, without taking a broader look at the situation in the region generally, and particularly the historical evolution of that situation, which has resulted today in the Middle East with problems that seem impervious to change, and with problems that are deep and pervasive, and in many ways quite structural. It's a place of brutally repressive governments as you look around the region. Syria, of course, being the poster child for that today, but Syria is not the only place. Even our ally, Egypt, is being led by a general, former General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who has proven to be not just an authoritarian leader and a Praetorian leader, but a quite repressive leader. It's a place where there are seemingly endless wars, again, not only in Syria, but also in Yemen and other insurrections around this troubled region. It's a place of weak regimes. Wherever you turn, you confront the most serious challenge, I think, of the entire history of this region, and that is the challenge of governance. Nobody in the Arab world is doing an effective job of governing their own societies. You have autocratic, despotic monarchies, many of which are our allies in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia. You have corruption and crony capitalism pervasive in this region. You have challenges to the rule of law, a population boom in which has resulted in the failure of societies to provide jobs and even food security to their own people. And you have a growing religious sentiment, Islamist sentiment, which, at least among some, has translated into violence. Against this backdrop, because this is not new, but against this backdrop, this system in the Middle East has experienced a number of shocks over the past 20 to 25 years that have further rocked its stability and have further undercut the possibility of change in the region. The first, although it may sound counterintuitive, the first was the end of the Cold War. The Cold War for many around the world, including in the Middle East, was in some ways comfortable. It was a bipolar world. Smaller states were able to play off the superpowers against each other. Political science, we would say that the clients were effectively running the patrons rather than the other way around. And the rules of the game were largely being determined by the two superpowers in a way that was not inimical to the interests of the smaller states. That came to an end in a shocking way in 1991. It left the world for quite some time in a unipolar state, the United States being the preeminent power. And it made a lot of countries uncomfortable. Uncomfortable because they weren't sure what direction to take. One example of this is if you look back at the the U.S. invasion of, or the coalition invasion of Iraq in 1991, in the effort to push Iraq out of Kuwait. Not only was the United States the major player in that coalition, it was an international coalition, But Egypt and Syria joined the coalition. Egypt sent 2 divisions, a mechanized armed division and a mechanized infantry division to fight alongside the United States. Syria sent a division to fight alongside the United States. This is a region where the thought of regional states fighting alongside Western powers in a fight against another regional state would have been unheard of just a few years earlier. So this was a shock to the system in the Middle East, and it was, in some ways, very challenging for the states of the Middle East to deal with this for many years into the 1990s. The second shock was not the first war against Iraq, but the second, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Because it was a war with the very dedicated purpose of regime change. The United States made a few secrets about its intention to overthrow Saddam Hussein. The Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, basically made the argument that the George H.W. Bush administration had erred in not pursuing the fight in 1991 to the finish. In other words, not ridding Iraq of Saddam Hussein back in 1991, and therefore was intent in 2003 to accomplish this purpose. Along the way, however, this was not just a war of regime change. It was a war that effectively destroyed whatever was called the Iraqi state. What did the United States do almost immediately after the initial round of fighting stopped? You recall, we disbanded the army, we sent them home with their weapons, and we effectively disbanded the government in the so-called de-Baathification policy, which said that anyone who was a member of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq could no longer occupy a position. Well, a lot of people in Iraq were part of the Ba'ath Party. That was the way you got a job. And so, in one fell swoop, after the expected military victory, the United States basically did away with the 2 pillars on which Iraqi governance, to the extent that there was governance, existed: the army and the state bureaucracy. Largely as a result of this, contributed to the evaporation of borders. You even had it, you recall the argument being made into the 2000s up until this decade, that maybe Iraq should no longer exist as a unitary state, but rather be divided into 3 states: a Shia state, a Sunni state, and a Kurdish state. You had this question that academics have been playing with as to whether or not the legacy of Sykes-Picot, the British-French agreement that was done in secret in World War I, had basically run its course, and there needed to be a new social contract that would define borders and define states in the region. The third shock to the system was the Arab uprisings that I mentioned earlier, because it did introduce this hitherto unheard of force in the Middle East called the people. It was the people that brought down the regime in Tunisia. Yes, a fruit seller, fruit vendor, self-immolated, and that became a rallying cry. And it proved that it could bring people out on the streets and that the army was not ready to intervene to stop it. And so Ben Ali, the president of Tunisia, ran away. Similar activities took place in Egypt that brought hundreds of thousands of people out to the streets. You remember the scenes in downtown Tahrir Square. Again, the army refusing to intervene, pushing behind the scenes for President Hosni Mubarak basically to abdicate, pushing him from power. The problem, however, is that these people had no organization, no platform, and no leadership. And so the shock to the system was twofold. Number one, that there was this new force we knew about other forces. You knew about militaries in the Middle East, and you knew about largely underground Muslim movements. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt had been around since 1928. Everybody knew it was there. You even knew about the so-called deep state, the bureaucratic infrastructure that kind of kept the machine running in these societies. But never before had the people become a coherent force that played a role in politics. But it was a flash in the pan. And the people went home. And so it was a double shock that they appeared and that they then disappeared. The fourth shock, some of which we're still experiencing, is what's happening with Syria, proxy wars. Professor Aronoff's class is studying asymmetrical warfare, various asymmetrical wars that are happening in this region. They happen worldwide as well. The unbelievable degree of human suffering that can be imposed on a people, as we've witnessed in Syria. How many millions of people have now been either displaced from their homes or exiled from their country? How many killed? Probably close to 500,000 now. By a regime that is so intent upon remaining in power that it's willing to kill as many people in its society as necessary to maintain control. And it looks like they're going to be successful. That war's not over, but it certainly is heading in that direction. But here too, in addition to the terrible humanitarian and migrant issues that have been caused as a result of this war, you also had the creation of more ungoverned space, which was immediately filled by whatever you want to call them, the Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, by this rising Islamist Sunni movement that was pushing back against many, many things, as well as pushing forward its own agenda. Pushing back against what the King of Jordan once called the emerging Shia crescent that extends, in his words, from Iran through Iraq into Syria and Lebanon to the Mediterranean. Pushing back against the deposition from power of the Sunnis in Iraq, where overnight, as a result of the American invasion, the Sunnis no longer controlled the state. They were thrown out in the army, they were thrown out in the bureaucracy, and there was an ascendancy of the Shia population. A breakdown of borders generally. If you look at maps, there's a very good set of maps over the past few years done by the Institute of Study of War. And if you watch those maps, there are no borders on those maps, because the Islamic State extended kind of all over the place between Syria and Iraq. We now read about the retaking of Mosul and the retaking of the areas that are being so-called liberated in Iraq. But it all suggests that this was ungoverned space where borders simply had been erased. And the fifth shock to the system, which is a shock that's been administered over many, many decades, has been the failure to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict once and for all, especially the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. An argument was made years ago. I would argue it was a false argument then, but it was still an argument that was made that the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict would spur change, would spur the resolution of many of these problems in the Middle East. It was a false argument. A second false argument was made, especially in the context of the run-up to the Iraq invasion of 2003, that the resolution of the region's problems needed to take precedence, and that would then resolve the Palestinian-Israeli problem. Both of those were artificial. The road to the region did not necessarily lead through Jerusalem, and the road to Jerusalem did not necessarily lead through Baghdad or Damascus or anywhere else. It's a region beset with problems, and there is a particular problem called the Palestinian issue, which, having been left unresolved now for its entire duration, however long you want to claim that it's been around, 70 years, 100 years, 120 years, represents a festering problem, a wound in this region that continues to infect much of Arab politics. And so the failure to resolve this conflict, as Professor Aronoff indicated in the introduction, very kind introduction, thank you. I've spent the almost 12 years now since leaving government trying to understand why, at least during this period when there was some great hope for a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, why we failed, we collectively. My focus has been particularly on United States policy, but it's a failure that is systemic in the region and in the United States. And in a sense, even though it isn't as dramatic an impact in time as the other shocks, this is a long-term pain for the Middle East. There has been a lot of good. The Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty, 1979, remains in force, and there has never been a significant security violation of that treaty. The political relationship between Egypt and Israel has been largely cool, been some ups, many downs, but the essential core of the treaty, the security provisions, have remained intact and observed by both sides. There was the Jordan-Israel Treaty in 1994, in which Israel cemented what had already been a significant strategic relationship with Jordan in the legal instrument of the peace treaty, making the Jordan-Israel border an exceedingly safe border. There's the possibility that was existing in the Oslo Agreement of 1993, which led not only to extended bilateral negotiations between Israel and Palestinians, but also multilateral negotiations. For the first time, many states in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, sat with the Israelis and started talking about issues that everybody recognized could not await a peace settlement, like the issue of water, or the environment, or economic development, refugees, arms control, regional security. It was an exciting period in the 1990s because we were having these meetings almost every day of the year. And those multilateral political meetings gave way to multilateral economic meetings, 4 public-private sector economic summits in Casablanca, and Amman, and Cairo, and Doha, that tried to show the region that not only would peace bring relations between governments, but could actually produce economic benefit to populations as the private sector took advantage of the openings created by peace treaties that we hoped would be formulated. But there's also been a lot of bad during this period. War after war after war. Violence and terrorism. Persistence of settlement activity on the part of Israel, and occupation practices which have come down very hard on Palestinians seeking to live normal lives. Spoilers on both sides, a lack of leadership on both sides. The results of these systemic shocks should not have been a surprise to anybody. First of all, there was the almost complete collapse of the state structure in the Middle East. Failed states replaced weak states. Lack of governance replaced poor governance. The state system, which in a historical sense used to be dominated by what happened in Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus, changed because it no longer made a difference what happened in Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus. And what really mattered in the Middle East was what happened in Ankara, Tehran, and Jerusalem. In other words, non-Arab states became far more important in determining what was important in the Middle East to the Arab states themselves. The rise of non-state actors. Think about the following. Since 1973, you can count on two hands the number of wars that Israel has been involved in with an Arab adversary. Not one of those wars started as a result of an Arab state fight with Israel. All of them started as a result of non-state actors fighting with Israel, whether the PLO, Hezbollah, or Hamas. Sometimes Arab states were drawn into the fighting, as in, for example, 1982, when Syria was drawn into the fighting. But it tells you that the weakness of the Arab state system and the essentially collapse of the Arab states as actors created a vacuum in which non-state actors now play a preeminent role. It also led to the intensification in many ways of the internal crises that I noted just a few minutes ago. Back in 2002, some of you may remember that the United Nations Development Program quite wisely turned to Arab intellectuals and public policy figures to try to figure out what was wrong with the region and how to fix it. And I say wisely because they didn't turn to Western analysts or Western public figures. They basically said to the region, you figure out what's wrong with your region, and you figure out what we should do about it, and then we, as the United Nations Development Program, can marshal the support of donors and the outside community to help you fix those problems. In 2002, these Arab intellectuals and public figures presented the first of, I think there are now 5, Arab Human Development Reports. They did a very intensive study, kind of in the mirror, looking at themselves, and they defined 3 major deficits in their own societies, which they recognized were holding them back. Number 1 was a deficit of freedom. They said, we're not free people. We don't have the ability to create political parties, free speech, free association, to think out loud. And that inhibits our political and economic development. Secondly, they said there was a deficit of education. Not the fact that there are no schools. There are schools and there are universities in the Arab world. But as they looked at those schools and universities, much of those places were still learning by rote memorization rather than stimulating creative thinking. I experienced this when I was serving as the ambassador in Egypt. When I arrived in 1998, I asked our director of the Agency for International Development to give me the metrics by which AID would measure the success of an aid program which had invested billions of dollars in the Egyptian economy, including in the area of education, building schools, and especially building educational possibilities for girls who were discriminated against. And AID, after a couple of months, produced both the metrics and the results. And it was clear that after $750 million of investment in the education sector, there was 0 progress. For every school we built, an existing school collapsed. Not necessarily the same day, but you get the point. We were not replacing schools fast enough to make progress in expanding the number of schools. And the number of girls in especially primary education was not increasing, even though the Egyptian population was increasing rather significantly. Now, in this case, as the ambassador, and frankly, I didn't want to ask Washington what to do because I didn't know what they would tell me to do, so I just went to the Minister of Education on my own, and I said, I'm not giving you any more money until you come up with a way that can prove to me that you're going to spend this money wisely, that you're going to actually build more schools, and at the end there will be more schools, and that more girls will go to schools. Well, you can imagine we had a crisis for a while, but ultimately they came up with a reform program, not drafted by Americans. That was not my idea, but one that they could own because they had drafted it. The point being that the identification in the Arab Human Development Report of a deficit in education was real. And these Arab public figures understood that you couldn't advance progress in this region if you could not advance education. The third deficit that they identified was women's empowerment. And it's in those reports. They said, how can we expect to move forward when 50% of our population can't move forward? In some places, they can't drive, let alone participate in the professions, in various sectors of the economy, as full members of society. Now, the good news was that this was a very honest self-examination. The other news is that 5 reports later show no progress toward fixing those deficits. So a region beset by the problems that I identified earlier, and then experiencing the systemic shocks that I noted, and coming up with a realization of what it was that was wrong, has not led to change. Now, I've spent a lot of time on this because against this backdrop, one can make the argument that talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict may be a little bit of a waste of our time, especially today. You don't have leadership on the part of the Palestinians or Israelis, or frankly Americans, that will take very bold decisions and then sustain the kind of diplomatic action required to translate bold decisions into a process leading to peace. You have systemic problems within each society that inhibit the prospects for a peaceful resolution. You have an Israeli polity which is moving to the right, in which even significant numbers within the governing coalition do not believe in a two-state solution. You have a split Palestinian society and leadership, with part of the Palestinian leadership governing in the West Bank, part still governing in Gaza, and governance generally is not very good anyway in either of those two places. And you have an American administration which, strangely enough, says that it's interested in the ultimate deal, as we heard from then the president-elect the day after the election, thinking that he could make the ultimate deal. But really having to ask ourselves the question, is this administration ready to do the hard things with both sides, Palestinians and Israelis, that would set up a possibility of reaching that deal? So the hard realities of the situation on the ground within this broader context of Middle East problems should leave us pessimistic. It should leave us with maybe the hope that we start out each day with, that maybe things will change, and things sometimes do change. But when we go to sleep at night, we realize that they've changed, but for the worse, as we've seen in the past period. Different efforts have been tried over the years to deal with this kind of problem. Some have argued, well, we really need confidence-building measures. If the parties aren't ready to actually negotiate, maybe they can do things that would satisfy each other's core requirements outside of negotiations and send messages that would build confidence. And I can tell you, having both participated in this process for almost my entire career, and then having studied it now for the last 11, 12 years, confidence-building measures in a vacuum do not work. And they don't work because they will require the parties to do things that are very hard without a necessary payoff in advancing the prospects of peace. And they don't even work very well even when you have a process. I'll tell you a short story. The Madrid Conference in 1991. A lot of hard work went into getting Arabs and Israelis to go to a peace conference at that time, including the Syrian government. And we visited Damascus before the Madrid Conference, after they had already agreed to go. And Secretary of State James Baker was sitting with the foreign minister, Farouk al-Shara. And he said to him, you know, we have to prepare for the kind of tough questions that you're going to get in press conferences that could really change the atmosphere. If you answer those questions the right way, it would be a positive, that would have a positive effect on the process. If you answer it the wrong way, it's going to have a negative effect. So Shara said, what do you mean? Example. So Baker said to him, well, what if you're asked, Mr. Foreign Minister, when you go to Madrid, will you shake the hand of the Israeli negotiator, which in this case was the Israeli Prime Minister? So in this meeting, Shara said, no, of course I'm not going to shake his hand. We're still my enemy and we haven't made peace. Baker said, fine, I'm not suggesting to you right now to shake his hand, but I'm suggesting to you not to answer the question that way. Answer the question by saying, our objective at Madrid is to make peace. I'm not going to get involved in these questions about little gestures. One day we will have peace with our neighbors. The meeting ends, we all go to Madrid. Shara goes to a press conference. Second question of the press conference, will you shake the hand of the Israeli Prime Minister? Shara says, never. So, not really a confidence building measure. It was a confidence destroying measure. And I can give you example after example of similar efforts to try to suggest these ideas for the parties when they weren't ready to negotiate that would send signals of confidence to each other. And they never, ever worked. There's also been an effort either to avoid negotiations or realizing they weren't possible to do things unilaterally. Israel, for example, undertook two very important unilateral moves over the past couple of decades. After 18 years of a residual Israeli presence in South Lebanon in the year 2000, Israel withdrew unilaterally. And what filled the vacuum in South Lebanon was Hezbollah. In 2005, after an occupation that had lasted since 1967, Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza, pulled out its settlements, settlers, and the army. And a short time later was greeted by rockets coming from Gaza. So unilateralism is not necessarily an answer. Now, the problem is that some people say, look at what happened with unilateralism, therefore a peace process won't work. So I'll give you the answer to that. Unilateralism doesn't work because you don't have a partner, because it's unilateral. And you have no one who's responsible for what happens the day after you've taken the unilateral steps. If you look, however, at the two examples where Israel has withdrawn from territory with a partner, with Egypt and with Jordan, it works. Because you have a partner on the other side of the agreement ready to fulfill the terms of that agreement. So arguing for unilateralism is not a great idea, and arguing that unilateralism's failures mean the peace process can't work is also wrong. Where does this lead us then? We have all these problems and we have these challenges, and we're in a region, or dealing with a region that is beset by so many problems that it makes it at least arguable that everybody should sit tight. Is the answer simply to hunker down and wait? And as you would guess, my answer is that also doesn't work. Because status quos, whether in a peace process or in life, are not static. If you are not moving forward towards whatever your goal or your objective is, you're not simply remaining in place. Situations change as a result of life moving on. So if you told me that a status quo would truly be static,
that there would be no more settlement activity and no more violence and no more incitement and no more occupation practices, well then maybe, if you have frozen the situation that way, maybe you can then hold out for a period of time. But realistically, that's not going to happen. There will be more violence, there will be more settlements, there will be more incitement, there will be more of everything that has impeded progress in the peace process, which means that the status quo doesn't work. Now, having said all this, I do want to leave you with a sense of optimism. And then I'm leaving town. I leave after this and I'm gone. Because I still think that a two-state solution is not only the necessary outcome, but it's also the probable and achievable outcome. And it's probable and achievable and even likely because there really isn't an alternative. We had a very nice dinner with some students and faculty just before this presentation and talked about it a little bit, and I mentioned that a few years ago at Princeton, my graduate students did a study of whether or not there are alternatives to the two-state solution. And they took that study very seriously. They wanted to prove that the two-state solution was not the only option. And they failed. They all got A's because they actually did well, but they failed in proving that there was a viable alternative that both Israel and Palestinians could buy into, and that was workable. Which gets us back to the only solution that has been known essentially since the beginning of this conflict, certainly since the mid-1930s, when the British developed the Peel partition plan. And that is the partition of this area into two states. One which is going to be the state of Israel and one which is going to be the state of Palestine. Neither state will occupy the territory that it fully desires. In other words, it will not occupy the full homeland of its people. The people of Israel will always consider all of Eretz Yisrael to be part of the homeland. People of Palestine will always consider all of Palestine to be part of their homeland, but they will exercise sovereignty in only part of their homeland, and hopefully work out arrangements to be able to visit and to see and to participate in the life of the areas in which their country does not exercise sovereignty. That is really the only outcome. How do we get there? I don't presume to argue for 10 commandments. This is a region that has enough of those commandments. You remember the movie, The History of the World, Part 1, where Mel Brooks, you remember, where he goes up to the mountain to collect the commandments, comes down with 3 plaques. And as he says, the people of Israel, I want to present you 15, and one of them drops. He looks down, he says, 10 commandments. I have the clip, I should have brought it actually to remind us. There are at least 10 things that the United States can do to advance the prospects of peace, even at this challenging time. I want to give you a sense of them. I'm not going to give all, none of them is as difficult as the real 10 commandments. The first and most important is that in the year 2017, the United States can develop the terms of reference for the next set of negotiations, even if the parties are not ready to negotiate on those terms of reference today. Many of you in this audience, I'm sure, are business people, lawyers. You've had other occasions in which to negotiate, purchase of your home, whatever. You don't walk into a negotiation without terms of reference. You don't walk in with the two sides starting from starting points that are so far apart that you can't even get to the second day of negotiations. You need a set of parameters within which the negotiations will take place. And the United States knows what those parameters are. Because we've had the experience of Madrid, we've had the experience of Camp David in the year 2000 when the parties did make a little bit of progress. We had the experience of the 2008 negotiations between Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas, in which the two sides made substantial progress. And we had the experience of Secretary of State John Kerry in 2013-14, where again the two sides made progress. In other words, despite all of these setbacks and problems, these two parties have narrowed the differences about what they're talking about, whether it's on borders or security or Jerusalem or refugees or economic matters or the electromagnetic spectrum or control over airspace. They have made significant progress. And if we ever expect at some point in the future to get back to negotiations, it's up to the United States to incorporate that progress into parameters so that when they walk into the room, they don't start from there, they start from there. And then the United States can help them move closer together over time in negotiations. Second, it's time for a significant monitoring and accountability system. One of the things I try to leave my students with, no matter what course I'm teaching, is the idea that if you're going to negotiate an agreement, and if you don't have a system in place to monitor the performance of the parties in that agreement, and to hold them accountable for their performance, you might as well not negotiate the agreement itself. And we have countless examples globally, including in the Middle East, where agreements that had no monitoring mechanism failed because there was no monitoring mechanism. And the parties then did whatever they wanted to do. One of the things I pushed back against in the first and second book that I co-authored was the idea, as part of our negotiating effort in the 1990s, that we would not hold the parties accountable for bad behaviors because we were afraid it would bring the peace process to an end. It was seen as stopping the bicycle from continuing. You always have to pedal. That's ridiculous. Because as the bad behaviors were accumulating and getting worse, the chances of actually making progress in the peace process were getting worse. And had we had monitoring and accountability, maybe we would have stopped the deterioration. And if we had not succeeded in stopping the deterioration, at least we would have ended the negotiations on a reasonable point, which is, if you sign an agreement and undertake to do certain things, we're going to hold you to that. So you have to have monitoring and accountability. And the third element is to exact consequences for the failure to do what you're supposed to do. The third issue is accelerating Palestinian statehood building. This year, we're fortunate at Princeton to be hosting the former Prime Minister of Palestine, Salam Fayyad, as a visiting scholar, probably for 2 years. Fayyad in 2011 came up with a plan to build the infrastructure of a Palestinian state. He said, and he still says today, the critical issue for Palestinians is first and foremost to take agency, or to assume agency over their own future. Stop blaming Israel, and stop blaming the United States, and stop blaming the weather. Palestinians have to do what Palestinians have to do. And so he said in 2009 that he was going to undertake, as Prime Minister of Palestine, a program for building Palestinian institutions and capacity, including the economic area, that would then be judged by the international community to see if Palestine would be able to function as a state in a two-state solution. 2011, it was a 2-year program. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank gave him an A for the effort. They said he had done it. Palestine wasn't going to be the UK, it wasn't going to be Denmark, but it was going to be a functioning, viable state with institutions that were governing properly, with financial methods that would be transparent and therefore successful. And what happened? Nothing. And in fact, if you talk to opponents of the peace process today, you know what they argue? Well, the Palestinians don't know how to run their own government. No, they actually do. And the world community has said that they do. So we have to now make this a reality. One of the commandments is facilitate the Palestinians to build that capability so that when there is a Palestinian state, if not today, maybe in a few years, it won't start out as a failed state. And finally, not finally, but a fourth example of the Ten Commandments is to do something that the administration actually thinks about doing, and that is to operationalize Arab involvement, the Arab Peace Initiative involvement in the Arab-Israeli peacemaking process. 2002 was a very interesting year. It was the height of the Palestinian uprising, Intifada. And the Arab states, in a summit meeting in Beirut in February, in the worst month of the Intifada, I was ambassador in Israel at the time, there was literally a suicide bombing every other day for about a month. So it was the worst month to do this, but at this Arab summit, they came up with what was called the Arab Peace Initiative, which basically said, if Israel withdraws from the territories it occupied in 1967, Palestinian state comes into being, capital in Jerusalem, an agreed solution to the refugee issue, and so forth, the Arab states will deliver to Israel the recognition and security that it so desires. This was a cosmic change in Arab state policy. And the way I would describe it is, until that point, if you asked what Arab state policy was, the answer would be 1948. In other words, calling into question the existence of the state of Israel. Let's go back to the 1947 partition plan and start all over again. By 2002, the Arab states had come to understand and accept that the problem was not 1948, it was 1967. It was the occupation of territories that Israel had not held between 48 and 67, and if that problem was resolved, there could be Arab-Israeli peace. Now, the interesting part of this initiative, a lot of interesting parts, is that nobody paid attention to it. The United States paid no attention at the time or subsequently. Israel paid no attention at the time or subsequently. But it still remains to this day as Arab state policy. And so you have a situation where this administration is now thinking about how to involve Arab states in the peace process. And this leads me to my final point. It's a kind of summation of the Ten Commandments. There are three basic methodologies that one could think about in advancing the peace process. One might be called top-down. It's the traditional way of having a negotiation. Israel comes in and makes its demands, Palestinians come in and make their demands, and you engage on the core issues. Borders, security, Jerusalem, settlements, refugees, economic affairs, and so forth. Top-down. There's a second way, which is bottom-up. Let's improve the situation on the ground. Let's build Palestinian capacity. Let's improve Palestinian life. Let's reduce the onerous nature of some occupation practices. And there's a third way, which is outside in. Let's bring the Arab states into this process, and maybe through the Arab state involvement, we could have peace between Israel and Palestinians, and then peace between Israel and the Arab world. And I would leave you with the argument that none of those works alone. It can work if we do all three. We have to walk and chew gum and negotiate peace, which I think is still doable between Israel, Palestinians, and Israel and the Arab world. Thank you very much. Okay, now we have some time for questions, I suppose. Yeah. Okay, plenty of time. Sure.
So, do you want me to stand up or?
Probably stand up, maybe identify yourself and speak loudly, and I would suggest actually ask a question.
Yep. So, I'm Josh, and I was wondering what, given your experience in this, what you think would be an effective solution for the problem of dividing control of Jerusalem?
There's a website called the Jerusalem Old City Initiative. If you Google that, you'll come up with a website at the University of Windsor, which is right here, right? It was a project undertaken by Canadian diplomats some years ago that looked exactly at this issue. The problem of Jerusalem writ large is complicated, but the real problem in Jerusalem is what do you do with the old city? The 1 square mile, 1 square kilometer walled city. And what the Jerusalem Old City Initiative came up with as a very creative solution is as follows. Basically, there is no solution. And that the two sides, having negotiated everything else, reach an agreement that they will defer claiming sovereignty in the old city and instead will do joint management of the old city.
And if you look up, there's now 3 volumes of the studies that were undertaken as part of the Old City Initiative. They looked at questions of security, jurisdiction, legal matters, land ownership, entry and exit. In other words, the components of sovereignty without the imposition of sovereignty. And so you end up with a management solution rather than a definitive sovereignty solution. If you go back to 2008, when Olmert was negotiating with Abu Mazen, he bought into some of this. Because if you look at Olmert's description publicly of what he put on the table, he basically put on a multi-party management system, in which Israel, the United States, Palestinians, Jordan, Morocco, which heads the Jerusalem Committee of the Islamic Conference, and I think Saudi Arabia, would jointly administer a governing system in the Old City. I don't think there's a sovereignty solution that works. At Camp David in 2000, they tried ideas of splitting the Old City, Jewish quarter, part of the Armenian quarter, going to Israel, the Christian and Muslim quarter, and the rest of the Armenian quarter going to Palestine. You're talking about 1 square kilometer. When I take students from Princeton to visit the Middle East and we visit Jerusalem, I first make them walk the old campus at Princeton, which is larger than the old city. To try to divide that in sovereignty terms, I think is impossible. So you have to end up, in my view, a shared solution, and this is what Olmert tried as well. Outside the walls of the old city, I think you essentially would be looking at a demographic-based solution. In other words, Jews would be governed by Israel, Arabs would be governed by Palestine. The borders of the 2 states would be a little squiggly. You know, they're going to run inside or blocks and neighborhoods, and that's the way life would be. It would essentially still have to be an open city with very significant security arrangements, but a demographically based solution probably works best outside the walls of the old city.
Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Ambassador. I had 2 questions for you, sir. So first, I understand that you endorsed former President Obama in 2008, and I was just wondering how you
Why
felt.
don't you stand up so people
Oh,
can
sure.
hear?
Sure. I was just wondering how you felt about how he handled the Middle East situation during his time as president, and how now President Trump is handling the situation currently, and then I can ask a follow-up after.
The question was, in 2008, literally the first time in my life, I actually got involved in the political process. For my foreign service career, I always registered as an independent because I was carrying out the policy of the United States. I never even told my children who I voted for. Having left the foreign service, I joined the Obama campaign in 2008. The question was, how would I compare and contrast his policy on the peace process with that of the emerging policy of the Trump administration? As is indicated in the peace puzzle that was referred to by Professor Aronoff, I would characterize the Obama approach as disappointing. The good news in the Obama administration is that the president defined the achievement of peace as a strategic interest of the United States. The other news was that there was never a strategy, there was a series of disconnected tactics, and there wasn't resolve to move forward when one of the tactics didn't work. It was try something, it doesn't work, then try something else. That doesn't work, and then we'll try something else. Until finally they gave up in 2011 to return to it in 2013 with Kerry. But even when Kerry ran into problems in 2014, what did the administration do? They called a pause. And that was the end of the peace process. So the good news was they seemed interested, but one of the things I do teach at Princeton is policy process, and it was a very faulty policy process with respect to peacemaking. On the Trump administration, we don't know yet. Here too, you have good news and other news. The good news is that if you leave the rhetoric aside, because the rhetoric has been fairly challenging, you know, moving the embassy to Jerusalem and we're going to close down the PLO office seems quite punitive in some ways. If you leave the rhetoric aside, the policy is almost continuous from its predecessors. There's been some unhappiness with Israeli settlements. There's certainly unhappiness with Palestinian incitement and violence. Right until now, they appear to be better listeners than I think people expected. We're waiting to see what emerges from that. And, we can all prognosticate about what it will be. Some will say maybe they'll do something good, others will say they won't. But it's too early to tell. There's still no there to judge it. You got to follow up.
Yeah, and to follow up on that.
I've never understood follow-ups before you hear the answer to the first question.
Yeah, so one of President Obama's recommendations was for Israel to go back to 1967 borders. And when I went to Israel 2 years ago and I did a tour of what the borders look like, to me it seems indefensible for Israel to go back to 1967 borders. I was wondering how you feel about that, whether in a compromise Israel would ever go back to 1967 borders.
Yeah, the exact formulation was not the way you indicated it. Obama's formulation in May of 2011 was to negotiate a border based on the 1967 lines, including land swaps, meaning that there was recognition that it would not be the exact 1967 border, would probably take into account the major settlement blocks, however they would be defined. Rather than give you my answer, I want to give you the answer of a 40-year veteran of the Israeli Defense Forces, Mayor Dagan, the late Mayor Dagan. I was at a conference in Jerusalem a couple of years ago when I was sitting in between Mayor Dagan on one side and Dr. Dori Gold on the other side. Dori Gold had served as Netanyahu's ambassador to the UN. He served until recently as an advisor to Netanyahu. And Dagan, as you know, served for 40 years in the IDF, rose to the rank of Major General, and served for 8 years as the head of Mossad. So Dori Gold made the argument that was implicit in your question. These are indefensible borders. We can't return to those borders. And he then went and delineated what he meant. Israel has to remain on the Jordan River, it has to remain on the high ground in the ridgeline of the West Bank, and so forth. Mayor Dagan, who has a little experience in defending the state of Israel, got up and he said, look, he said, the only defensible border is the border that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, will defend. And no matter what border the government negotiates, we will defend that border. If you ask me, I'd like the border to be a little bit bigger rather than smaller. But if we need to do a smaller border in order to get to peace, I will take that border because, and this was the critical thing that he said, having a peace partner on the other side of the border responsible as they are for their side of the border, as we are for ours, is an incredibly important security component. And we can hold them responsible. If they don't do a good job, if there's infiltration or cross-border operations or missiles and rockets, we have somebody to hold responsible. And therefore, if it turns out to be a smaller border, closer to 67 than some people would like, IDF will protect it. Take your choice. You can choose the idea that Israel has to retain territory and probably not have peace with its neighbor, or you can choose the idea that Israel will have less territory, have peace with the neighbor, and then live with those consequences, meaning a challenge, a security challenge. The last point I'd note, I mentioned this at dinner with the students. Go to the website of the Center for New American Security, and you'll see about 6 or 7 months ago, they published a study largely undertaken by General John Allen. General Allen was appointed by Obama to continue a study that had been started by General James Jones, who then became the National Security Advisor for Obama. And the nature of that study, which is still classified, was to talk to the Israelis about whether or not the security that they currently enjoy by holding the territories could be met by a whole range of security things. Demilitarized zones, separation of forces zones, international guarantees, international involvement, international observers, point after point after point, multi-layered. And what the study basically indicated is that nothing is equal, but you can come pretty close to providing Israel with significant security in a smaller border, as Israel believes it enjoys now with the bigger border. Again, it's a question of analysis. The IDF did participate in the study, although they took no position on its conclusion, at least that we know about, since it was classified. But it's a matter of great importance, and the security issue in a settlement is going to be, for Israel, perhaps the most important issue. And then the political choice will be, as I've defined it. You keep the territory, you don't have peace. You don't keep the territory, you have peace, and you try to replicate the security that you had previously with these multi-layered security arrangements.
So my name is Graham Wise. So in recent weeks, there's been talk between Hamas and Fatah of like reconciliation. How do you think that'll impact the peace? I saw today that the one thing that they're still waiting on is Hamas will disarm. So kind of what do you think about that?
One of the other commandments that I mentioned was support for Palestinian reconciliation with conditions. And the conditions are my conditions are quite important. It's a valid argument that Israel has that it can negotiate with part of the Palestinian community. And right now, the Palestinian political system is divided between the West Bank and Gaza, and is geographically divided. And so any agreement that Israel would enter into with the Palestinian Authority that governs the West Bank would not necessarily apply to Gaza. And that's unfair to ask Israel to have to negotiate twice to deal with a final settlement. Therefore, you almost need to have reconciliation of some sort so that when Israel is negotiating with the Palestinians, it would apply to the entire Palestinian entity. The conditions, however, are critically important. Hamas, as you know, doesn't recognize the state of Israel, has not renounced violence, and has not agreed to the third condition of the international community, which is to abide by and implement agreements into which the Palestinian Authority had previously entered. And those are the three conditions which have prevented or stopped the international community, including the United States, from talking to Hamas. Those conditions are valid, and I think that they should remain in place. I don't think necessarily, however, that they have to be a barrier to Hamas's joining a government which has accepted those conditions. In other words, if Hamas joins the Palestinian Authority government, they occupy the ministry of X or the ministry of Y, and they have their own position, but the government's position is still loyal to the Oslo conditions: recognition of Israel, renunciation of violence, acceptance to implement the agreements that were entered into. I think that it's fair to continue dealing with, relating to, and negotiating with that Palestinian Authority. In fact, today, one could make the argument that you have such an example of that bifurcation in the Israeli government. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said publicly, as early as 2009 at Bar-Ilan University, that he supports a two-state solution. Many members of his coalition do not, and yet we deal with the Israeli government, which means that we accept the idea that the government is committed to a two-state solution, even if individual parties within the government are not. So the conditions are quite important. I'm not suggesting that we give up on those conditions or that we give Hamas a pass, but I think the idea of bringing them in some way to a government that is loyal to those conditions is critically important to moving forward in the peace process. There's a question up here somewhere. Yeah.
So my question was, from the knowledge that we learned today, in your lecture, what can we go out and do to push forward this process?
I don't know who your congressional representative is or your senators, but I would get in touch with them and say, press the administration to press the peace process, to do the right thing, to have a strong and sustained approach, to be fair, to continue support for Israel's security requirements, to continue support for Palestinian institution building and economic requirements, and not to get discouraged by setbacks along the way. I think that's the best thing we all can do, is to shore up whatever resolve exists on the part of the administration to do something in the peace process. The second level of that is, don't just get involved, but do the right thing. Do smart peace process. Come out with terms of reference. top down, bottom up, outside in combination, not separately. But to have Congress put a little pressure on the administration to keep going and to support the administration if it does the right thing and to do it hard. I think that's the smartest thing that we can do as citizens, frankly. You could also join the Foreign Service and actually negotiate peace. But,
They aren't hiring yet.
yeah, sir.
So some people on the Palestinian side, and their supporters say, well, it's not possible to make peace. We can't trust Israel because it keeps building settlements. And on the Israeli side, at least on the right side of the Israeli spectrum, and some others, they say, well, we can't trust any agreement we make with the Palestinians. Look at their education system. Look at the incitement that even the moderates like Hamas engage in. So what would you say in response to each of those?
Look, I could have spent the last hour giving you even more reasons not to trust anybody on the peace process issues. And if you don't want to do this, you can come up with exceedingly logical, reasonable, valid arguments, because there is an absence of trust. And there is a long track record of bad behavior, which continues until today. And there are broken promises and broken agreements. And there are hardline positions. And you can go on and convince yourself that this is really a bad idea. The real question, though, when you go home after convincing yourself of that is this healthy for the United States in the first instance? It's our country, but also for our friends in Israel and our friends in Palestine. Is it healthy to make the excuses why this is not doable, or to do the hard work and try to make it happen? Now, it wasn't easy. We look back at the Egyptian-Israeli treaty and say, oh, well, these were two states and you had two powerful leaders. It was not easy. And it required a very strong, determined push by the Carter administration at almost every juncture, starting from the beginning, to keep those two sides talking to each other, to resolve little problems and big problems, to come up with bridging positions. Camp David in 1978 didn't just happen in 13 days. It was preceded by months of pre-negotiations, including heavy drafting at Leeds Castle in the UK, where the first draft of the Camp David Accord was actually put together. So even in a situation where you had, in a sense, an easier environment, two countries, they're established members of the UN, it was hard to do. The Jordan-Israeli peace treaty took 15 months. And these countries were essentially at peace for 40 years before that. It took 15 months to put that together. So if that deters you, the idea that this is going to be hard,